Welcome everybody. Thanks for joining me this afternoon. And as many of you know me by now, hopefully, if you don't, feel free to say hi. My name is Christine Minotto, and I'm the director of the UCSF Enrollment Institute. Before I start today, I want to remind you of a couple things, or maybe three things, that we have our startup operation support, where you can get a lot of resources for your startup, from legal to banking. You can go to our website, therosemantinstitute.org/resources. And as many of you know also probably that we have a weekly podcast. So feel free to tune in to many of our guests. We try to bring a lot of different diversity of story and a background, and basically everybody who we think is really interesting and also have a lot of passion in improving everybody's health. So if you like the podcast, feel free to leave the feedback of the review. We would really appreciate that. And last but not least, before I introduce Dan, is that I want to let you know that the Roseman Innovators application is now open. The deadline is April 11, and we provide a lot of in-kind services, mentorship, access to early stage funding, and also community that you be participating when you are selected as the Roseman Innovators. And so with that, I want to introduce you to Dan Brounstein, who is the Senior Vice President and President of Saluda Medical. So Dan, I know way back when we both were at Hartford, when Dan was an engineer at Hartford, and we reconnected 3 years ago, I think, almost. That's when I roped Dan in to give a talk and to share his experience and insight with you all. And pandemic happened, and we have to postpone a couple times. And so one of the things that I talked to Dan is about, now that he had a lot of experience in the sales and the clinical trials, is that not only when you start developing a product, got a product, and now what? I think at the end of the day, when everybody developing a product, you want the product to get into the patient. So I asked Dan to tell the story or share the experience that he had on how to bring that product into commercialization that help him to become successful in bringing that adoption. So a little bit of background, as I mentioned, Dan and I, we know each other way back from Hartford days. But before joining Saluda, he held the position of VP of Marketing and Clinical Operation at Spinal Modulation, where now he led where he most recently led US operation for their IDE pivotal study and directed the marketing and business strategy. And so with that, Dan, take that away.
Thank you, Christine. Is everything up on the screen now? Just want to make sure.
Yes, good.
Great. Yeah. So like Christine had said, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to be able to talk a little bit about the story. I've had the pleasure to get to know Christine again over the last couple of years, and then I just enjoy getting involved with the Roseman Foundation. I've got to be involved with some of the mentoring of a couple of companies that look like they've been successful, not because of me, but just because I got to meet some really cool folks, and I love that part of the job. So happy to share anything outside of this talk too. I'm going to leave you my email and contact information if any of this is useful for folks. And I tried to keep this fairly high level and really tell the story just through a case study. Also get to talk at the very end and give a little plug for my current company, Saluda Medical, just because we've had some incredible news over the last week or two. So the timing can't be better in terms of coming on and telling the story. So I'll start with just a little bit about me, because I feel like, for folks that are entrepreneurs or looking to become entrepreneurs, it is an ultra marathon. And I think recently we were talking about it as like multiple ultra marathons over many different years. So that's a bit of my passion outside of medical device. I spend a lot of time in the trails, and we were just talking about that before this, is that recently I've moved up to Truckee and Lake Tahoe, and it's just it's kind of my dream to live up in the mountains. So I've got trails sitting here, and my background is one of my favorite spots in San Francisco, where I usually go for my runs into the Marin Headlands. This is a couple pictures of us from myself and a couple of my friends doing Leadville this summer. And at the end of it all, there is a finish line, and the finish line is sometimes also the beginning of another start line in terms of building your company or building your strength. And for me, at the end of it all too, is you'll see a couple things, just because I recently went to Legoland, that I've got a family too, and so there's a bit of they're along for the journey and incredibly supportive. So don't forget about them as you start to build out your group, your company, and your endeavor. So a bit, I want to talk a little bit about my background, because I think it's relevant to the whole story. I started out, as Christine had said, I was a very young engineer when I worked with her back at the Hartport days, and I was very fortunate to be part of two acquisitions, really right, coming out of school. And I led, R&D projects across many different products, from cardiovascular to women's health. So got to see a lot of different things from the R&D side, which I think really helped myself in my career as I move forward. Big plug for UC Berkeley, coming back, getting your MBA. Spent a lot of time on the entrepreneurship side of trying to start my own company there. Actually competed in a business plan competition for an MRI technology that we ultimately won the business competition. The other company that tied with us ended up exiting for, I think, a couple $2 billion, and then we never got it off the ground, unfortunately. So that was too bad. So I decided I had to go and work for somebody again, and luckily landed at a little company called Spinal Modulation. And this is really the story that I'm gonna tell. I got to come in at an incredibly early stage, just really idea, concept, just starting the technology, and got to design and develop a neuromodulation system. And to be honest, at the time when I got the job, I really didn't know much about neuromodulation. And that was a really good perspective. Actually, sometimes it's best to not know. Worked my way up from just an R&D project manager all the way to VP of marketing and leading the clinical operations, which ultimately led me to my current company, where again, I got to start at an early stage, but not as early. So I think that one is a little less relevant, because it had already been going for 4 or 5 years. Much more complicated project, but really transforming neuromodulation through closed loop therapies. And I'll tell a little bit at the very end of my talk. So when you look at the different aspects of the path from concept and bench to sales, I'm not going to go into the details on every single one. I'll hit harder on areas that I'm more of an expert or have more experience on. The first part of it is the market opportunity and dynamics. Obviously, IP. There's a lot more people that are experts in IP. The regulatory and clinical pathways are very relevant. I'll dive into that. Talk about some of the tools that we've used for enrollment. How we think about study design. Hit a little bit about funding, because I think it's relevant as you start to think about building up your value over time. And I think there's a little bit of a formula. I'm starting to see it across, especially companies in neuromodulation, which are active implantables, which are long development times, 6-7 year development time. So you really got to think about, where your inflection points are. Get into the study design and how we do that in enrollment. And then one of the key parts of this is the KOL and clinical partnerships, thinking about who are you going to partner with early. The folks and the physicians that you do partner with end up, helping you throughout the journey in many different ways. And there's a way to assess that in a way to really not take advantage, but partner with folks. And then finally, I think there's a really great learning on the reimbursement side. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of details on that, but just touch upon that. So the first step, really looking at the market opportunity. And what I'll do is I'll stop probably after each section, just look to see if there's any questions that I could answer or dive deeper if we need to. So spinal modulation. What is spinal modulation? It's a company that was founded out of Stanford and EQ Labs back in 2005 by Mir Imran, who's a legend in this field, legendary entrepreneur, and Daniel Kim, who's a neurosurgeon out of Stanford. When I came in, they had just raised Series A from De Novo and Kleiner Perkins, and they were tasked with developing a delivery system for stimulation of what's called the dorsal root ganglion, which is really just the nerve structures that help prevent or help treat chronic pain. So what I want to do is start with kind of the end in mind, right? There was a VP of sales that I worked with at Spinal Modulation, and on his first week, what he did was he came into the office early, and he'd actually written a press release. He printed it out on a newspaper. It looked like we were in the news. It looked like we were in the Wall Street Journal, and it was basically the vision of where we were going to be in 2 to 3 years. And funny enough, it was we were going to be acquired by St. Jude Medical. And within the press release, and if you take a look at some of the key messages in here, this doesn't come by chance. This really comes from the planning that you're doing from the beginning, from how you're designing the product to how you're designing your clinical studies, what you want to say ultimately about the product. But there's the big takeaway here was that we proved effectiveness in treating conditions that were underserved by traditional spinal cord stimulation. And so that didn't come by just chance. That was actually very deliberate as we started as we went along in our journey from 2007 until 2015 with the acquisition. So just a quick update, and I put a plug in for my current company. This is this is our product. This is what it looks like. Spinal cord stimulation has been around since 1967. It was first discovered or invented by Norm Shealy. Very simple procedure. It's percutaneous. You put leads in the epidural space, and it sits over the spinal cord. It's a super easy procedure. Leads they deliver a little bit of a mild electrical pulse. Some people feel like a little bit of sensation, and others don't feel anything at all. But it interrupts the pain signals. And so patients have a controller. Physicians can actually program the patients. It's a very well-established procedure. So why would you even consider getting into it? So at the time in 2007, it was a $1 billion worldwide market. So when you start looking at your markets, depends on where you are in your development. I'm sure many folks have a great idea, great concept, great technology, but are looking for a home. What area do we enter first? So that really checks the box. $1 billion market. As you can see, it was slated for high teens growth. And there was actually a significant market outside of the U.S., which is which I'll touch upon as we go through the story. And there's 3 major players, but really minimal innovation over the last basically 7 to 10 years. So just not really looking at what was the future. The other part of it is just like funding acquisition activities. This is what got me excited about potentially joining here, is that there had been 2 major acquisitions. How are you going to exit? Are you going to build your own company? Are you thinking about IPO? Back in 2007, the medical device IPO market wasn't great. I think it's only been recently as Nevro entered the market in 2015, and even more recent, it's incredibly active. But 2 major companies with big acquisitions, over $1 billion, and there was funding with Nevro, us, Spinal Mod, and another company called Mainstay, which actually has done pretty well recently in 2022. So where do you start? Why would you enter the market? This is a big part of how we think about developing the product and thinking about what do you want to be able to ultimately say about it? What's going to be your differentiation? So the spinal cord stimulation market in 2007 had huge unmet clinical needs. I couldn't believe when you started looking at the literature that really 25% of patients respond to therapy after 1 year. And this is what we called the 50-50 club. So you basically have a time where you get to try the system, you get to trial it. It's set up in 2 procedures, and only about half the patients actually responded. And then long-term, only about half the patients responded. So it really had been the end of line treatment after all else fails. When you looked at opioids and back surgery and other types of treatments, SCS wasn't a place that, it was definitely being limited by the fact that it wasn't predictive of long-term responders. Fairly black magic, mechanism of action wasn't well accepted or well known. There wasn't a lot of work that had been done in that area. We had an opioid crisis that was on the horizon, and there was a limited patient population. Neuropathic pain is huge. It's beyond just patients with back surgery. It's patients that have had other types of surgery. And this is really where we looked at Spinal Mod for that opportunity. And I'm going to stop after this slide and I saw there was one question. So how do you put together this opportunity? Like this is, this looked easy. It's not, right? There's a lot of work that goes into figuring out where you're going to take the technology. And I just thought it would be good just to share with you, how I approach a project. I think getting analyst reports and really understanding if it's a hot area like neuromodulation right now, it's, most analysts are covering these small companies, and you can really learn a ton. Market surveys that are in there, how the market has grown. Literature searches, obviously very, very obvious place to take a look. Getting your KOLs, and we'll talk about that later. They can teach you a ton, just getting qualitative market research, asking KOLs, research reports, sales reps. I worked a lot early on when I didn't know the market with people that had been in the space for a long time, and they can help you a lot, but they also can bias you too. So you have to be very, very careful on really listening to them and understanding, how you can differentiate in the market. And societies and conferences, just spending a lot of time there. And that was what I did in my first couple of years, is just get out to big society meetings and conferences, because you just learn it. You learn a ton and you absorb a lot, and that's really where you meet your KOLs. So that's really setting up the problem. This is, we had not defined this when I came in 2007. We started working through this, but a lot of it was, we had an interesting technology, some IP, but we really didn't know a place for it. So we started to build some of that out. So maybe I'll stop there. And Christine, I can't. Oh, there I can. I guess there was no open questions.
Yep.
Okay. Cool. I'll keep going then. So the next step really gets into the level of kind of expertise, more of what I've had over the last 15 years, kind of looking at the regulatory and clinical hurdles and differentiation. Again, I'm going to make this very specific to spinal modulation. There's obviously decisions that you're making, as an entrepreneur, but looking at it as a PMA versus a 510K, I think interacting with the FDA early, making sure that you're having the FDA offers pre-submission meetings where you want to put together your strategy and get feedback on the strategy is incredibly important. Looking outside of the US to help mitigate clinical and regulatory risk, and we'll talk more details about that. And part of that is thinking about your European and Australia strategy. So and obviously there's other countries, but specific to this area, neuromodulation, these are your big areas, your big markets. So if it's somewhere else like Asia or somewhere in that area, then you would consider those strategies. But what was interesting about this area back in 2007 was even though it was a PMA, typically pre-market approvals require some type of clinical data. There had not been a true clinical study in this space for approval, which is just amazing. 1967, this therapy was invented, and now we're looking at almost 40 years later. So the barriers to entry had been very, very low, and even recently, companies that Boston Scientific, who had purchased Advanced Bionics, received approval with just a literature review, and they disproved safety because they had a rechargeable system. So it was just a rechargeable system. And ANS, which was St. Jude Medical, now Abbott, had received a paper approval. So that was great. So coming in, like I was like, oh, this is fantastic. We'll just go get a paper PMA. This is going to be a super fast time to market. I remember the first timeline I looked at, 2010, we're going to be selling. So that went away pretty quickly. So we didn't start our FDA pre-submission meetings until like 2011, 2012, pretty late. We also had another company, Nevro, who was also innovating in this area, and they were actually about a year ahead of us on everything. So we could actually see what their strategy is and learn from what they were doing. So quickly, we realized we were going to need a clinical study, and at the same time, we were also looking outside the U.S. U.S. outside the U.S., especially Australia, is super quick in terms of getting ethics committees approvals. Once you get your testing done, so these are really great areas for you to be doing early clinical research. And ultimately, if you do want to be selling in those areas, the bar today has gone up. Back then, the bar was much lower, so it was an easier place to enter the market and get some experience. With changes in the medical device regulations in Europe, the bar is really going up. So you have to really decide whether it's worth it to go into Europe prior to going in anywhere else. But at the same time, thinking about ISO certification 14115 compliant protocols. So as you're designing your study designs, making sure it's very easy to incorporate this, because at some point you might want to consider being compliant with MDR regulations. So when you think about what did we do from a clinical standpoint? So first of all was, and I didn't really go into a lot of detail here, is that there was a lot of benchtop testing. We were trying to figure out how to deliver a lead and steer it within the epidural space, similar to a cardiac system. What we decided to do was try to get clinical data as early as we possibly could. So we used a non-significant risk, even though it's a PMA product. We actually use a non-significant risk approach, and this is on the FDA website. And you can go in there and take a look at what that if you qualify for that. But since we were going to just place leads within the epidural space, but actually pull them out, so just trial them and get some data, we saw this as an opportunity to prove that we could actually get pain relief in our first study. And it was a quick process. We did not have to go through an IDE, but it was open for us. The next phase that we decided that we were going to go after was looking at OUS, because we could get into Australia, into Europe early. So 2010 was about getting a fully implantable system, our own device, and start to build our long-term clinical evidence, but also be able to support international sales and file our CE mark. So this was kind of where we decided to go, and then begin selling in Europe. So our thought was, gosh, well, we're going to do a paper PMA in this area of 2010, 2011, get our CE mark, simultaneously be working on our FDA submission, and then we're off to the races, taking over the world with DRG stimulation and treating huge unmet patient populations. So that didn't happen. So this is kind of where there's always changing regulatory clinical barriers to entry as you go on in your development, and the bar rises, raises, and the bar shrinks. And I've seen it now in 15 years of working in neuromodulation. So we ended up running this CE mark study thinking that we were going to get an FDA approval pretty quickly after that and get ready to sell. What ultimately happened was, with 30 patients for 3 months, so it wasn't a lot of data. They, in Europe, they were not asking for a ton of data. That is definitely changing. You really do need to be working with your notified body if you really want, before you start a study now. But we ended up getting our CE mark in 2011. So on time, we were ready to sell. We started building up our commercial activities, and then ultimately started to sell in Europe with our generation 1 product. So we started developing the market in Europe and Australia. We were, became actually market leaders in some of the European countries, and we were taking significant market share. It just happened to be, and it's part of the strategy, but happened to be from one of the major competitors out there, really taking pretty much over clinical sites. So at the same time, we were working through our pre-sub submissions with the FDA and and looking at starting our investigational device exemption study. So they finally got back to us. Nevro had started and initiated a study about 12 months before, and it set the bar for new clinical studies in the space. And so Spinal Mod began discussing the study design with the FDA, which really helped having Nevro out there. But they were asking questions as, needing a comparative arm, understanding blinding. We tried to make sure that we now used our European and Australian experience to help with the design. But you also have to realize you need a study design that you can win. This is like the one bet that you have, right, with the company. This is what you're putting your money into. And I'll talk more about how we got into that. So I wasn't sure. I saw there was one question. I can stop there and then we can keep going.
I think the question is for later, probably, because the question is around early adopters with small staff don't have the people for big sales posts, how to get early adoption. I think that might touch on it later.
Yeah, I can come back to that for sure. Yeah, if there's any other questions, please throw them in there. I definitely can go deeper on some of these topics. So I'm not going to go into the really discussion on how we were pitching our therapy, but just kind of how did we go from in 2006, $15 million post money investment to a $400 million acquisition. And it does get into your clinical and your regulatory and your sales strategy. So the beginning is really just failing fast. Before I had gotten there, a lot of work had been done on what to do. So there wasn't a lot of direction on exactly what we were going to go after. How, putting leads on the dorsal root ganglion seems obvious, but there was just a lot of work on how to build a stimulator, not a ton of work that had been done on actually creating a commercial product. So I'd come in, that was really my first project of getting this into the clinic as fast as you possibly can. This $7.5 million ends up hurting you later on as you get into later rounds, especially as your valuation keeps rising. So most of the next part of it was focused on clinical proof of concept. So that's where we did our non-significant risk study, and we moved on to the next phase. When you're done with the study, I remember our CEO, Dave Wood, talking about this, is we got to 10 patients. Every physician wanted to do more. But we proved, we pretty much had, we're ready, had lined up our next round of funding at that point. You just have to stop. You don't want to go further. It's like, selling something and then trying to, sell after you've already, finished your sale. That's what you need to be looking at with the clinical. What's the minimal amount of data? Because it is expensive. The next part is what's interesting is that we ended up getting different investors, strategic investors, so Johnson & Johnson came in and led, they were the first strategic in, but they also actually had a bet on Nevro at the same time. So the neuromodulation space in 2010 was starting to become pretty exciting. There was, paths to revenue as Nevro was starting to prove, and we would prove pretty quickly. And we actually raised on our first implant in Australia. So between 2008 and 2010, it was really just one single implant that helped us with our valuation at that point. But we really, I think one of the big learnings that we had was raise more earlier, have enough money to be able to get you through some unexpected areas. And the unexpected area was starting our clinical study. So Medtronic came in pretty quickly after that with our Series D. So we had Medtronic and J&J as board observers, which was interesting. And we got, you get to know what the strategics are really on the inside now. So they give you great terms, but they also have a ton of inside information. So it becomes a bit challenging, especially as you start to sell the device. So even though in the US we were still clinical pre-FDA approval, you know, they were part of our board, and so there was a lot of work to be done in terms of keeping that information, you know, especially our selling information from them. And then the final piece of it, you know, was that we ended up at the very end getting into a distribution agreement, and we had a deal with St. Jude Medical with the right to purchase based on a couple of milestones. And I think there was a ton to learn there too. We were selling the device in Europe and Australia. You know, this was sort of at the end of our funding. We were pretty much close to running out of money at this point, hence the $7.5 million being really critical in our delay in the FDA. But ended up negotiating, and we ended up working closely with St. Jude Medical and distributing our product in Europe and Australia, which is it's a whole topic in its own right. How do you deal with selling and selling against, you know, selling with your competitor at the same time you're actually competing against them? So tons to unpack here. I just wanted to give you a sense of like what we were going through as we were raising the money, and I'll come back to that. So I saw a couple questions in here. Maybe what I'll do is go from, I see some. Okay. So someone asked the question, I missed the point, the $7 million Series A hurt you later, too much dilution early. Did you need it in retrospect? Yeah, the point of that is really that, you know, you want to be as efficient with your cash. So, you know, you get into Series D, we would have liked to accomplish earlier on, you know, some of the milestones within the Series A. So it becomes very dilutive later on if you're not hitting, like, you know, key milestones along the way as you go up and increase your valuation. So there wasn't a lot of increase in valuation between A and B. So that definitely hurt us. Yeah. I think how to penetrate entities without being part of a major medical device company. Someone's asking the question of like, what are the first steps, processes, overall insight when you're a small company? And I think part of that comes from how you choose your clinical sites. So we've done, you know, I'll talk a little bit about that later, but I think it's good to mention it here. As you start thinking about your clinical partners, they should become your evangelists as you enter the market. So when we looked at Europe and Australia, again, this is 2007, so there wasn't as much established KOL. So there's definitely were key opinion leaders at that point. We looked at, you know, big volume centers, those that were going to hopefully be on the podium, those that you know, liked innovation, and really spent, you know, good time on educating them on the product, and they come along with the journey for you. So when you turn to sell the device, they're the first people to line up. So I remember, you know, in Europe, we got our CE mark and immediately, you know, went to the purchasing departments at 3 of our clinical centers. One of them was in Belgium, which is a whole nother, you know, you have to consider reimbursement, obviously, in these European countries. So that was a little bit further away, but the other 2 were in the Netherlands. And within, you know, a couple of weeks, we were able to get, you know, our price list and contracts approved, and became part of the practice, and ultimately we had, you know, 70 to 80% of that practice. So you can see how important it is to make sure that those physicians, don't forget about them when they're going to help you with your initial commercialization, and they become the ones that evangelize. So we ended up going only to 3 or 4 centers in total in the first year in the Netherlands, even though, you know, we could have gone to a lot more, and we just really drove deep into those centers. And the physicians that were part of the clinical trials, you know, were, you know, on the podium. They were helping us. They would go to, you know, referral talks. They would go to other physicians in the Netherlands and help evangelize our product. So I'm gonna keep going, and then we can come back to some of the questions. Hopefully that answered that question, but it's really, really important. So as we started thinking about the protocol development of what we call the Accurate study, so this is ultimately where the FDA required us to do a double or a randomized controlled study against an approved stimulation system. You've got to start ultimately with the end in mind. But at the same time, and when I say the end in mind, I mean, what do you want to actually say about the product, which is really the third column. But you want to be able to declare victory, at the minimum bar. So what the FDA at that point was looking at, and currently is looking at, is 3 months of efficacy data, which has become the bar in this space, but ultimately 12 months of safety data. So all of our statistical plans were based upon that. So the FDA will, and we learned our lesson currently at my current company. They'll acknowledge your statistical plan, but there's always risk that the FDA changes over time, especially if you're running a study over multiple years. You got to make sure that your statistical plan, even though you get buy-in from the FDA, is valid. And I think it's a point that one of our consultants brought up. Is always get second and third opinions about the statistical validity. Learn from your competition. There's somebody out there that knows in your space, and unless you're just pioneering the way in your space. What the statistics were on products that were approved even within the last couple of years. And then the final part of the statistical plan is like, ultimately, and it's pretty specific to neuromodulation, is like, how do you power yourself so that you get superiority claims, but not risk approval? So ultimately, this study was based on inferiority of DRG stimulation to conventional spinal cord stimulation. But we also did have a secondary analysis that looked at superiority. And that's really important as we start thinking about marketing the device. What do you want to be able to say about the device? What do you want to say about the patient populations? Like when we go back to the unmet clinical needs, we saw that it's primarily focused on patients that have failed back surgery, or they call it persistent back pain syndrome. Now, it's like, we looked at other markets, and so we were focusing on focal neuropathic pain, which really had been an unmet need, and we designed our study to try to win off of that. And the last piece of the protocol development, which is really, really important, especially if you're in an area that doesn't have reimbursement or has reimbursement challenges, is just thinking about getting a cost-effective, expert to help weigh in on your protocol design. What data can you collect, outside of just, the primary and secondary pain data? Thinking about, medications and medical usage, and what can you incorporate into these studies as you build it out. And it becomes really important, especially as you go outside of the U.S., to be able to have some of that data to help support and maintain reimbursement. So we did all of that within the ACURATE study. It helped me later with our current study design as we started to design that. And we'll just take a look at any other questions there. So ultimately, when you look at the marketing claims today of dorsal root ganglion stimulation, it looks simple. It's funny, we're going through the same exercise at Saluda Medical. DRG stimulation is clinically superior therapy compared to conventional spinal cord stimulation. It's the only system to treat this disease, CRPS or causalgia, which is like focal neuropathic pain conditions. And then ultimately within here, and it was a secondary outcome within our study, was that we could actually deliver targeted treatment. So in spinal cord stimulation, super difficult to get stimulation in like a really small area of pain. And we designed case report forms and secondary outcomes that looked at specifically targeting these treatment areas. So all of this went into years of study design, and ultimately testing this out outside of the U.S., where we were running other clinical studies just to validate that we could get this, and then ultimately went into our study in order to get these claims. But these claims, when you look at these websites, they come from a lot of planning. So from a clinical study execution standpoint, and this is really where we're, I think that there's a model out there when you start looking at how do we be successful. It starts with your field team and your clinical operations team. There's the enrollment aspect, which, when you're reporting back to the board, I remember how many conversations you had early on in enrollment in studies. You always have these flat lines. It's like so hard to get started. contracting at sites, and then the sites get started and they don't enroll anybody, and you're just sitting there and it's the bottom of the hockey stick. What can you do? You should be paranoid, right? Am I ever going to enroll these studies? And no matter how many times you do these studies, you always are concerned that you're never going to enroll these studies. And I think part of that last bit of it is you've got to choose your clinical partners, right? And I'll talk more about this. So the clinical operations team, and you would always give a shout out. My partner, I've been working with almost for 10 years now. I worked with her at Saluda Medical, and now I'm working with her at Spinal Modulation. Now I'm working with her at Saluda Medical. It's really the quarterback of the study. So, I think the first step is like, what do you do? I know that when you're a startup, you can't afford, can you afford a contract research organization? Is it cheaper to do that? Or do you bring somebody in internally? I really feel strongly that you need to have a strong clinical leader who really understands and run many studies, who really understands the execution, because it's so important. You can use CRO support, although you never get the attention of it. It happens to be that this person worked at a CRO, but she was so fantastic. You don't find these people every day. They're going to help you with study design. They're going to help you work through the regulatory, with regulatory and get FDA approval. They're ultimately going to be, there's so much work to be done on managing review boards, especially in large studies, monitoring the data collection and consents, making sure, what's most important is you're collecting, you might be enrolling, but are you collecting good data? And you got to be checking the holes that you have in your data, developing the training materials, and then ultimately you got to decide what database you're going to use. It's not easy. You could do everything paper. We've always done things in electronic database, but with paper forms for many reasons from a cost standpoint. So these are big decisions that you have to make. This person that you bring in or consult with has to really know what they're doing, because this is the person that I think is critical to the success. The second part of it is really the is the person or the people on the ground. This gets underestimated. In the neuromodulation space, there's a lot of aftercare support. You have to be programming patients. You're always in the physician's office. You're supporting the operating room. Probably not unlike many like surgical procedures. You have to have no people that can support the procedure itself. They're also going to be helping preventing missing data. They're going to be on the ground helping you with enrollment management. It's not just on the clinical ops people. It's really on the field people. And that's where you're going to start seeing your results. Good people that are always in the office and always top in mind. They're organizing referral dinners depending on what type of patient population. They're making sure patients are being followed up on, phone call follow-ups. They're doing a ton of work for you. It's not just showing up for a procedure. They're also making sure that the staff on the ground is trained, and they're supporting clinical operations. They're really the running back for, the quarterback, So it's not always true that you need I think people call them like CRAs or field clinical engineers. I think, what I've seen is success across multiple studies is sometimes salespeople are really good, especially ones that are, detail oriented. You want to get strong folks in the field, and ultimately you want to think about, as you go from clinical to sales, what are these people going to do, right? Continue to support future studies, but a lot of them become your training and education managers. They go in, become clinical support. You really need to think about the future as you go through this. The final piece, and I like to pride ourselves, like myself and my team, on enrollment. Enrollment, like I said, always starts out like a hockey stick and then accelerates. It's gonna happen, right? But don't sacrifice outcomes and patient selection for speed. Think about the tools you have and start, you can't do everything. You can't afford to have all these different things, especially as a small, a small startup. You might have just a little bit of funding, but I always say, always be paranoid. I'm always paranoid when we're starting a new study. Set those enrollment goals, talk to the sites, like really try to do your diligence on sites, whether they say they're going to enroll. Look at kind of past history. I have my favorite sites that I like to work with because I know that they're going to enroll, and I know they're going to enroll good patients. And you always want a couple of those sites in the studies I've used, for really important studies, recruitment consultant. There's outside firms that do this or help you with just organizing it. You can develop something on your own, with Excel sheets, but they're not that expensive. There's a company I use is Galen. You want to track everything, track referrals and consents. And I'll show you just kind of images of what we do. Building campaigns for sites and meeting often with the site staff, always being top of mind, engaging really in all aspects of the practice. Like, this sounds like obvious, but it's a ton of work to enroll these studies. And they it's like out of sight, out of mind. If you're not in the office, they just forget about you, no matter how exciting your study is. Write your newsletters and emails, for competitive enrollment. Most of these physicians are just like, they see somebody on top of them, they're gonna go to their site staff and really push on them. And we always start with building out in-clinic posters and education materials. Like, you want to have all this, you want to look professional, especially on pivotal studies. I mean, I think it even goes back to even some of the early proof of concept studies. Just look professional. It's not hard to do. It's easy to do. You can get a designer to help you with putting materials together that just have to go through IRB, and ultimately things that fuel that are a little bit more expensive or advertising campaigns. We use Facebook is my favorite, but PR pieces are really impactful. And for a couple $1,000s a month, you could get a decent PR consultant to help you, like pitching news stories to local sites, and those drive in a ton of referrals. And then finally is like a medical monitor, just making sure that you have somebody who is looking over whether the patients are meet the inclusion exclusion criteria. So this is a lot that I've learned over the years. I remember 10 years ago sitting down as we started looking at enrolling this Accurate study and not knowing where to start. I think you can prioritize pieces of this, but all of them are important, and they all help accelerate your enrollment. I can I'm just looking at questions right now. How to find early adopters with a small staff. Don't have the people for big sales pushes. It was one of the questions. Well, it's the case with every startup. I think you can't go to everybody, so you really want to make sure that you have a key set of accounts that you can serve with with a small staff. I mean, I think at Spinal Mod we started with five or six sales reps all over Europe, and just focused on a couple accounts. So that I think it's everybody's problem, and you're not going to make a big impact if you try to spread everywhere. Let me keep going. I know we're going to run out of time. You warned me about this, Christine, so apologize for this. But these are things I can share with you. Some of the tools that we use, just examples of tools and the newsletter. So I think it's really important just to get into choosing your partners and clinical sites. This is, like, to me, the most important piece of being successful, with the clinical work that you're doing. You look at, I have this gigantic spreadsheet that we looked at for choosing our sites in the US even recently. And these are many of the components that we looked at. What is their society influence? Podium presence, later podium presence to begin education to others, like spreading out beyond like the clinical sites, keeping up on changing payer and competitive landscape. Like, you really want people that are either within the societies or kind of rising up within the society. So knowing who's going to be next up within the big, your big societies. You want to understand if they're going to be a commercial partner. Are they early adopters? Do they have large volume at the sites? You don't want every site to have large volume, but it's really important as you come out of your clinical stage. Experience with executing on an IDE. It's not easy to run a pivotal study. It takes lots of diligence. You want people that have done it. Otherwise, you're going to run into all sorts of issues with nonconformance. You want sites that have experienced clinical coordinators that you can partner with. And then ultimately, publication impact, looking at academic versus private practice. In the world of neuromodulation, private practice has a huge influence on publications. So it's not cut and dry, but in other areas, you obviously want your big academic institutions. So you'll see a big, when you take a look at our publications that we've done at Spinal, even at Saluda, we definitely looked at, a good mix, payer influence, who's influential on RUC committees. And then you also want to be looking at who's next. When you finally get to market, it's going to be 2 or 3 years, especially for an IDE study. You want to think about who are the up and coming folks out of fellowship or 2 to 3 years out of practice. So just do your homework on your KOLs. I think that's going to the conferences. Most famous may not always be the best for you. Some cases they are, some cases they're not. And they can help you with all sorts of things. Partnering, with spinal modulation was the development of the product, cadaver design evaluation. We were doing a lot of that with like 3 or 4 key KOLs. They get on the podium early. They start to prep the market. So they're out there talking about study design, theories on, why dorsal root ganglion stimulation could be the next big thing. They help participate in investor presentations. We brought them into pitches during our funding rounds, and ultimately they support you during enrollment. But all I would say is just temper your expectations on what they will deliver. They will advise you, but a lot of times they're not going to do the writing. They're not going to write the protocol for you most of the time. I'm sure there are exceptions out there, but in reality, the KOLs are the ones that are really going to be helping and guiding you. So, and think about how you're gonna evolve this group over time. So I feel like we've done a really good job at Spinal Mod. We did a great job here at Saluda on helping to develop the KOLs. And so a wise person said to me, "You're never going to make everyone happy. So there's never going to be enough work for everyone. So just be prepared that you're going to have those difficult conversations." So I will stop there. I'm not going to go into the reimbursement, but just, where are we today now? Spinal modulation has been fully integrated into Abbott, and they've treated tens of thousands of patients worldwide and developed actually a new system that fits onto their own platform. So from our standpoint, it was a fairly R&D device that didn't stop Abbott from or St. Jude from buying us. They ultimately spent 18 months on developing it, and they've trained hundreds of reps and physicians on the therapy, and it's really a key to the success. So very proud of that accomplishment there. I will. We only have a few minutes left, so Christine, why don't you guide me how you want to go?
Okay.
You want to take a look? Yeah.
Maybe you can answer some of the questions. I think one of the question came is I think this is maybe when you were talking about the timeline, is like, at what point did you have an implantable system tested in patient?
Yeah, so that was Series C. So that was like right after our Johnson & Johnson investment and right before our Medtronic investment. So it took us from 2007, it was 2010 that we had our first implantable system in Australia.
And the next question is, can you go deeper into the interaction with the strategic funders, J&J and Medtronic? What was shared and could not be shared?
Yeah, I mean, early on when we were not commercial, Johnson & Johnson was a great partner. They have great programs for small companies. They want to offer a lot of services to you, like reimbursement strategy. There was a lot of cool things that we could do as we developed, especially with the strategics that were competitive, like Medtronics and St. Jude. The board meetings were very focused quickly on updates, like clinical updates. How are you guys doing on the clinical side? But when it got into like sales and strategic discussions, we quickly the board observers had to leave. So none of them had board seats. That was a conflict of interest. They were just observers. So ultimately, you had private, the executive sessions without them on there. So we had to be very careful on the sales side. You couldn't share anything on that side.
Okay. Next question. What kind of equity do you give an early KOL?
That's a great question. What kind of equity do you get? Oh my gosh, it's a good question. That's changing. I think with back in 2007, there was no Sunshine Act. So Sunshine Act is you have to report on the value of it. I think I think you just have to be careful not to give away too much. I mean, that's something you can tell. I can tell you offline. I don't want to give away my secret on that one. You gotta be careful.
Okay. Last question. Question from, you had mentioned some useful tools. Could you please share those with us? I think you just skimmed through it really quickly.
When you talk about tool.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, from it, I went through the enrollment piece. I think that's some of the magic. Like, how do you guarantee that you're going to have enrollment? So I think I went through that in somewhat detail. The study design piece and making sure that you're designing the study to get FDA approval. I think one of the biggest things to keep in mind is try to make sure that you're going to win your study. So what can you do to mitigate the risk internationally? Run a study to get, to look at that endpoint prior to coming into the US. Much cheaper to do. You want to fail outside the US. You don't have to run like the exact study, comparative studies, but just make sure, like, for us, it was comparing against the literature. We knew that it was really difficult to treat the patient population that we're treating. And we picked out the very specific patient population that we were getting our best outcomes. We were running post-market studies internationally and tracking that. So we went back and looked at our data before we even got started. So I think that is one of the keys before you enter into your IDE study.
I think you mentioned, I think you share something about the Excel spreadsheet, like where you can use as a framework for tracking all this clinical studies. I think you mentioned that earlier. I think that was question.
I put it in here, and I'm happy to. Yeah, I mean, I went through it super quick. Sorry about that. I feel like I was running out of time, but so what we have here is this is an incredible tool. Like, on the left-hand side is just looking at, like, each site. We have a strategy and plan. We have the roster of who's on the clinical side. We know how many patients are in the pipeline. We know how many referrals are coming in, and then we put together a strategy from PR to Facebook to referral dinners, and then we track where those patients are coming. And that's what the power of having we have this thing called the Galen Gateway, and this thing is it's a website that has a survey, and the survey helps you screen out patients, so we know where the patients came from, how they got into the system. So it just gives us like this pipeline look at almost like if you were in sales, it'd be like, I know exactly how many patients are being referred into my clinic. It's exactly the same. But this is incredibly powerful, and it's a lot of work. It's you want to have somebody who's like managing it. So at Spinal, it was we had a director of marketing. It was like half of her job, and then we actually used an outside consultant who does this for a living, and they just have weekly meetings. That's really, I think it's incredibly important as you go forward. You're not going to enroll a study unless you really, really work hard. So can I just, I know everyone's, and keep organized 100%. I just wanted to share, just so I know everyone's going to leave. So this is where we are today with Saluda. I said we had exciting news, but we received our FDA approval for our device after many years, and incredibly proud of our team. And if you go to our website, Saluda Medical, you'll see a new website which has all of our claims, all of those claims we had been working on from the beginning in terms of our study design. So very similar story here at Saluda, from like the science and building out the technology to FDA approval. It took us it took 12 years. I've been here for 7 years. So I came in 2015, pretty much the first day before our first human implant. So again, lot to learn here, but I figured the Spinal Mod was a story that was done.
That's right. Well, thank you so much, Dane, for sharing your story and your insight. And thank you, everybody, for joining us.